Good evening, community. Please be welcome to this special edition of Stories from Soldiers, from military personnel, from armed forces. A topic that you like very much, as you showed in a recent survey where we asked you what our next special episode should be about. That's why we've been gathering the most chilling stories on this subject that we've received recently, and some that we also searched for in the archives. And that finally will be able to be shared with all of you. So we hope you enjoyed this episode very much, that you're in good spirits, that everything is going well, and if not, that this is the excuse to let go for a while of any problem that keeps you awake. The only good reason not to sleep is because of the fear from tonight's stories. So turn off the light now and let yourself go, for Tales of the Night is beginning. My name is Janet, and I have a 5-year-old boy. I no longer live with my son's father, but we have a very good relationship. He is a soldier, and the last time he came to visit us, he told us something that I believe is worthy of Tales of the Night. You see, they were deployed for several months in a violent, dangerous zone. Every day they were alert from first light until nightfall, and even asleep, they were ready for whatever might happen. Suddenly there was a commotion about a patrol they had lost communication with. They hadn't reported anything strange, not a confrontation, not the presence of suspects, nothing. The patrol had only notified the zone they were entering, and then nothing more. Pure silence. And somehow, the silence was even more worrying than if they had reported entering an ambush or something like that. That simple disappearance raised alerts, and they sent a good part of the personnel to search for the lost patrol. That's when the worst happened for Esteban, my boy's father. Well, in the middle of a road, passing by a ravine, they noticed something strange. A smell of death, of old death, that caught their attention. Although they were searching for their companions, they couldn't ignore what they noticed, what they smelled, because they already recognize when the death they smell is human. And there nearby, in that ravine, there were definitely dead souls. It was nighttime. The zone was dangerous. So they reported the finding, and that a couple of elements would go down to check while the others stood guard on the road. And one of those who went down was Esteban. Later, he realized that a vehicle had fallen there because of the broken tree branches. But it was also noticeable that it had been weeks ago because the broken branches had returned to growth. When they went down far enough, they noticed that below there was an army truck, and when they reached it, they found the bodies of several companions already decomposed by time. Now then, the strange thing, community. The incredible thing about this is that the truck and the companions were the same ones who had disappeared hours before. However, both the state of the corpses and of the truck and its surroundings showed that they would have been there for at least a couple of weeks. They didn't believe what they were seeing, nor did the superiors when they arrived at the place. People of other ranks came, some who almost never came. Very important civil authorities arrived. A group of experts and forensic doctors from the capital arrived. Nobody understood what they were seeing, and above all, nobody could talk about what happened. What is the press going to say about a situation like that? Or the victims' families? I don't know what they must have invented for the poor families to give them the remains without letting them see them. I don't know if they cremated them in the end and only gave them the ashes, or if everything was arranged with money. But those who arrived first at the truck, those who saw everything, were given a month of rest. Esteban still hasn't recovered. He doesn't understand what he saw, and the poor man has aged so much in a couple of months. He says it's all because of what he saw. That experience will mark him forever. In his eyes, you can see that he saw something terrible. The following story, dear community, is one of the most disturbing we've told in a long time. And although, like all of them, it has that paranormal element that's difficult to believe, that perhaps goes beyond ghosts or witches, remember that we are all skeptics according to our experiences, that we all start believing a little more according to what we live through. And if you have the great fortune of continuing to be skeptical, take advantage of it. we continue with this special episode. Stories from the military. My Uncle Gabo was in the military. The story I want to share with you, community, is one he told me once when I was about 11 or 12 years old. At that time, he and his wife lived in a little house that my parents rented, right behind ours. It was for a few months, an emergency while they caught up on some debts. But I remember well that I really enjoyed that time because my uncle spent his time playing music for me, teaching me bands and singers I didn't know. A time in my life that formed many of the tastes I have now, and also resources. Time for the stories he told me. He was a man full of anecdotes, and among them, there were some of an inexplicable supernatural character. As I said at the beginning of my story, he was in the military, and during those years, a couple of completely inexplicable events happened to him. But the most impactful one, he only told me once, and afterward, when I asked him to repeat the story with some of my cousins, he preferred not to. It was hard for him to narrate it, and he had done so with me in confidence, nothing more. This happened in the 80s, on a mission that took his troop into the mountains between the Mexican states of Michoacán, Jalisco, and Guanajuato. If anyone watches the news in Mexico, they'll know that now those states have very dangerous zones with a lot of organized crime. But back then it wasn't like that, not so much. And his small troop was advancing on reconnaissance work, searching for a specific trail. They had information that someone was hiding in those places where nobody lives anymore, where nobody could live, in the mountains, in the most inhospitable part of the region. They were advancing, having left far behind the last towns. One early morning, it was his turn to take the last watch. He woke up to watch over the troop during the last hours before dawn. Braulio, the youngest of the group, who for some reason admired him very much and was always following him, also woke up, even though it wasn't his turn for watch, and decided to accompany him. The place was quiet. The silence from above was absolute. They doubted the clues they were following. So they were somewhat worried following because they were obeying orders, but not so much because they believed they were going to find something. But, as he always told me, it happened to me for a reason. Things happen for a reason, and I believe they were up there for a reason. One that was perhaps more important than the original one they had been sent for. It was about 4, almost 5 in the morning, when it was still nighttime, but no longer so dark and more blue. When from their lookout post, he and Braulio were watching a small plateau in front of them. One that led to those small trails that eventually, after dozens of kilometers, led to settlements in the area. There they were, talking in low voices. When suddenly Braulio fell silent mid-sentence, widened his eyes, stood up, and looked out toward the plateau, but chest to the ground, as if he had heard something. My Uncle Gabo did exactly the same, trusting the instincts and good hearing of the young man. He drew his weapon and observed attentively. In the distance, you could hear that someone was approaching, someone who was coming singing. He looked very carefully. They could hear it, but they couldn't see it yet. But someone was approaching, someone who was singing without a care in the world. And finally, they could see him coming out from among the branches that led to the trail and entering the plateau with low grass where they could now observe him with complete clarity. When he told me the following, my Uncle Gabo wanted to hide that his eyes were filling with tears. He stopped the story for a moment, breathed, and then told me the following. He saw through his weapon's sight a man who was advancing, dancing as if in a childish dance, but he was doing it to advance, and also as if everything were part of a macabre dance. He was wearing a costume. His clothes were very baggy and seemed full of moss, like the kind that grows on stones, as if he were wearing a serape, a poncho of dull green moss. Despite being a couple of dozen meters away, as soon as that strange man entered his field of vision, he brought with him a stench, humidity that penetrated their nostrils. He had a strange hat, also a hat he describes as a cowboy hat but flattened, dirty, and with the edges to the sides instead of to the front and back, as they are always worn. And there was something more. That man was wearing a mask, a medieval jester's mask, a mask that looked like old porcelain, dirty with black eyes. When he entered the plateau, when he went several meters in, they could see that someone was coming behind. A child following a few meters back, advancing in the same strange dance, a child who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. And then another, and another, and another, and another, and one more. 6 small figures followed him dancing at a distance, in clothes that couldn't protect them from the cold of the mountains. My uncle, with a silent signal, asked Braulio to go very carefully to wake the others. He observed each of the children, from the smallest at the back, going one by one until reaching the first, and then he brought his sight back to the jester. When he did, he noticed that he had already stopped and was looking directly toward him, with a face that seemed furious, and both things were completely impossible. My uncle was among the branches with camouflage without making a single sound. It was impossible that he could have seen him, but it was clear that he did. It also seemed impossible to him to see a look of fury in a mask that he had just seen seconds before, and that didn't have it. He says that perhaps that's a confusion of memory. What he does remember is a signal from that thing that made all the children run in all directions, toward the bushes, toward the ravines, toward where we were coming back from. And he also remembers that against all instructions, when he returned his sight, that thing that was now also running toward the bushes, he fired a shot, hitting it between the back and the shoulder. But that thing kept running until it was lost from sight. The troop in a second was already there, running toward the plateau, getting lost among the bushes, among the ravines, trying to reach the children who were hiding in that macabre dance. They did it as if they had been waiting for a signal to run and go after them, although the reality was that just seconds before they were asleep and were running after them. Although they didn't even know why, only with the intention of putting them to safety from whatever that thing was. And they caught up with all of them, except one, the smallest one. Of the jester, that one. There was not the slightest sign, although they searched for hours. They gathered the kids on the plateau and gave them blankets to cover themselves from the cold. They trembled with the mountain air, with that freezing air. The children didn't know what they were doing there. They had no idea how they had gotten to that place, or what that thing was they were following. Nothing. When they were asked where they were from, where they came from, they all said different towns that were hours away from each other. They all remembered going to sleep the night before without feeling anything strange, without experiencing anything weird. They all cried from nerves, trying to understand why they had suddenly woken up in the middle of the mountain, being caught by soldiers among the branches, among the bushes. A helicopter arrived for them a few hours later, and the troop received instructions to return. They wanted to continue searching for the man, for the jester, and for the missing child. But they were assured that they would send helicopters to continue combing the area. My Uncle Gabo couldn't stop thinking about that look, about what he felt when that thing turned to look at him, a look that he felt pierced his chest and soul. He also thought about that accurate shot, about how it entered the back of that man without stopping him, without slowing him down in the slightest, despite the weapon's caliber. He always thought about that poor child, the smallest one, about whom nobody could know anything. Because of that experience, and because of others more earthly but equally hard, my Uncle Gabo understood that he didn't have what was required to make a career in the army. He wasn't as tough as needed. The things that happened stayed with him for a long time, and as soon as he had the opportunity, he requested his discharge. He then sought the most peaceful life he could find as a merchant, with one of those stands that are set up in markets, that are set up in the street every day in a different place in the city. And although it was a profession that in lean times made him go through difficult moments, like the one that led him to live in the little house my parents rented, he never again faced the terrors, The horrors that are out there, very close to us or far away in the mountains. I tell this story not because I hadn't wanted to before, but because my uncle passed away in October. I've been thinking a lot about him, and I feel that, although he was very shy about telling these experiences, it's a way of remembering him, of keeping his memory alive with me, and now with you. Thank you for your attention, community. My name is Jose Armando. I'm a Spanish teacher in a rural school, and I'll share with you some of the stories that the children have written in exercises, stories and legends from their families. Around here, there's little to do. You're either a teacher, military, or a narco. We don't have more opportunities because farming is no longer done. My cousin Gustavo, a soldier like his uncles and like his grandfather, he doesn't tend to exaggerate. He always speaks as if things were instructions, reports, or lists to be fulfilled. Part of his military training, family training, on his mother's side. That's why when we started talking about what happened in the mountains that early morning, his voice felt different from how he always speaks. Not affected or firm, just tired. As if what had happened he no longer wanted to even remember, but couldn't get it out of his head either. The patrol order came simply. Review the perimeter of the area where strange movements had been reported for days in what used to be a hamlet. It was an abandoned mining town, a handful of houses half fallen for decades, roofs of sheet metal bent by the wind, and a chapel so small it looks like a warehouse. Nobody has lived there for many years. The rumors about what caused the abandonment varied, depending on who told it. Paramilitary groups, disputes, disappearances, and other stories that were no longer rumors, but warnings. The truth is that it wasn't because of the mine's closure that formed the town, because that had happened a couple of decades before the town was completely abandoned. The convoy that went was small, only 2 trucks. They arrived at dawn because the commander said that nothing could be heard anymore, that the sun deceives. At night, on the other hand, the true sound of places filters through, staying between branches and roofs. Gustavo had never been in that mountain range, but the mountains felt heavy, enormous, still, as if they didn't want company, as if they didn't like anyone passing by there. They first walked the dirt road, and nothing. An old tire over there, a broken chair, a bicycle without tires next to a tree and becoming part of it. The kind of abandonment that doesn't feel recent but very old already, as if that place had also forgotten that someone lived there once. At 3:40 in the morning, Morales, a thin but very talkative corporal, went ahead a few meters. They weren't looking for anything specific, just protocol. Look at windows, check doors, point the lamp without entering. When they reached the last house on the road, an entire wall had given way, revealing the interior. The lamp barely managed to illuminate a wall with faded religious prints, and a skinny cat crossed the room without hurry. Who knows how long it had been living there? Who knows where it had come from? Everything was still, so much so that he was beginning to consider withdrawing the unit and marking the perimeter when, without warning, the radio sounded at full volume. They weren't clear voices, nor static either. It was like an attempt at words, cut off. Gustavo said that the first thing they thought was that it was another troop arriving, but nothing in the sound had human cadence. Even so, they responded, and nobody answered. It wasn't until they heard the first sound outside that they understood they weren't alone. It was something similar to a song, but without melody, like a low humming made for oneself. It didn't come from the front, but from the trees. It was a single voice, but they didn't know if it was a woman's, a man's, an old person's, a young person's. It couldn't be identified. Morales lowered the volume of his breathing. Gustavo just raised his hand so nobody would move, and they saw how the figure appeared little by little, like someone coming out to see if anyone arrived from the bushes. A white silhouette, thin, with a shawl that wasn't a shawl but something longer, like a seamless garment. It walked slowly, as if wrapped in it, from feet to head, with no intention of approaching. It stopped in front of the little chapel, right where there was a rusty Christ. It turned toward them, not quickly or dramatically. It turned as if hearing its name. The face was covered. They didn't know with what, not a mask or a veil. But it wasn't uncovered skin either. It was something in between, too pale. But that managed to hide its face, its features. My cousin Gustavo said that the strangest thing wasn't the figure, but that nobody gave the order to aim weapons. And yet everyone did, as if the body had decided on its own. No instruction, no command shout. The figure raised its head toward nothing, toward the mountain, and behind that action, the forest responded. The wind was heard moving the branches, the heaviest ones. The radio sounded again, this time clear. Withdraw. It wasn't anyone's known voice. No name, no code, just the order. The voice. Feminine. Gustavo said it was impossible to know. The only thing they agreed on was that there was no static. It was never too clear. When aiming again toward the silhouette, it was no longer alone. At its side, among bushes and stones, there were two other figures. One of the recruits wanted to speak, to ask something, but no sound came from his throat. It simply didn't obey. My cousin is sure it wasn't fear. It was something else, deeper, as if his voice wouldn't come out either. One of the figures raised its arm, as if saying goodbye or blessing or dismissing. And then, yes, the forest spoke. It was as if the mountain itself breathed hard, deep, just once, as if shaking off all the terrain, the trees, and then silence. They withdrew without running, because running would have been admitting they didn't understand what they saw. They got into the trucks. Nobody spoke. My cousin only said, "Let's go." They wanted to do harm, but they also didn't want us to continue there. They wanted us to leave. The next morning, the report was filed with a code that nobody explained. Something that means no hostile contact. Community, we're still here. Thank you for continuing to listen. The previous story and the one that follows seem to me to be in the same line because they talk to us about ghost towns, and we have many of those in Mexico and Latin America, for different reasons that, if we look closely, maybe aren't so different in the end. We take this opportunity to ask you that if you or your family come from a town that no longer exists, search in your memory for stories from that place. It will do you good. It will do them good to remember it. And besides, every time I at least pass through a place like that, I'm filled with curiosity to see it in other times, full of life, full of people. And what better way to do that than through their stories? But well, for now, we continue with more stories. My brother, a soldier. We're twins. We were born from the same pregnancy, although we're not identical twins. Anyway, even though we're not identical, as you can imagine, we have a very special connection. In fact, this experience that I'm about to share with you, I somehow felt even before he told me about it. I felt that fear, that desolation of what happened that night. My brother also listens to Tales of the Night, but he asked me to write this story, and I'll do so respecting everything he told me. So this one's for you, brother. What I'm about to tell happened in Oaxaca in February of 2020. A detachment made a call for help from a ghost town, a settlement of a few houses that for more than a year had not been inhabited by anyone. It was an area somewhat besieged by paramilitary groups, those who made all the people flee. My brother's company responded to the call. It was early morning, and they found the members of the detachment locked in one of the houses, with barricades, and truly terrified. Seriously, scared to death. He tells me they found brave men, the kind who face death without thinking to fulfill orders, scared like children, trembling, thanking God when they saw that their companions arrived. Everyone was scared, and only one of them managed to explain what was happening, why they were hiding there, what had been there that night. The corporal explained to them that they were conducting a patrol in the area. The town had been abandoned for some time, but they were taking a look to verify that nobody was hiding there or looting what was left in the houses. There, a skinny dog that approached them without fear caught their attention, as if expecting water, something to eat, or a pat on the head, whatever it might be. They felt sorry for it. When people leave in the middle of the night to save their lives, their children's lives, sometimes the animals are left behind, and it was obvious that if there were other dogs that had stayed there, he was the only one that survived. And who knows how? Because it was evident that he had gone weeks without eating. They gave him something to eat, thinking he wasn't going to survive the night, so they decided to stay with him for a while, feed him. They couldn't play with the poor dog because he didn't have energy, but they didn't want to let him die alone. They gave him water too, but it was too late. It seemed like he was waiting for them because as soon as they walked with him, following him to what seemed to have been his house, the poor thing lay down at the entrance to sleep and didn't wake up again. The soldier said that he had a dog that he missed and that he couldn't help but see him in the place of that poor abandoned animal. He thought about how much it would hurt if his dog died like that. So they decided to bury him there, in what was his house. And when doing this, when digging the hole and burying him, when they threw the last shovelful of dirt on him, night fell. Out of nowhere, they all felt something. Let's call it a hunch, but they felt danger nearby. It was so clear that they grabbed their weapons, although they hadn't seen anything yet. They formed a defensive position almost without thinking, and then they heard how from the darkness, from an abandoned house in front of them, something seemed to be approaching. From behind some old boards, they saw something peeking out. The first thing they thought was that it was another abandoned dog, because of the ears and the shining eyes. But then it showed its head completely, and it was clear that it wasn't a dog. The size, the color of the ears. It was a coyote, an enormous coyote, peeking out, stalking. They shouted at it, and it didn't react. Someone took a stone and threw it, and it hit right on a board, a few centimeters from the animal's face. But it didn't flinch in the slightest. It didn't move at all. And that made them uncomfortable, that it wasn't scared. Coyotes generally avoid contact with humans, and at the slightest threat, they run. But not this one. On the contrary, it stood up, let itself be seen. It was then that they realized that wasn't a coyote anymore. It was something else. It was something that stood on two legs like a human. That was tall, very tall. However, the head, the arms, it was obvious it wasn't a person, that it was a beast, but something they had never seen before, something they couldn't understand. There were shots in the air. The being again remained still, unfazed. They understood that if it didn't fear the shots, it was because they weren't going to cause much damage to it. One of the soldiers shouted profanities. Another began to pray. Without thinking much, they retreated and took refuge in the house where they had buried the dog. They heard movement next to the door. One of them realized that that thing out there wanted to dig up the dog, and he fired. He didn't know what it wanted that body for, but he wasn't going to let them use it for something bad or eat it or whatever it was, but what he wanted was to bury it. After the shot, they saw it move away through a window, run toward the abandoned houses again. At that moment, they still didn't want to send any call for help. It didn't seem right to them. They said they thought it was a situation they could control alone. But the truth is they were embarrassed. And minutes later, they heard screams from several men, as if answering from one side of the town to the other, between houses, communicating with each other. They were screams in Mixtec, a language they recognized well. They lost sight of the dirt street in front of them for an instant, and it was enough so that when they realized, they observed they were surrounded. There were coyotes sitting as if they were normal animals, but with sizes that didn't correspond with the animals of the area. They could see several of them sitting at different points around the house. They didn't respond to the profanities they shouted, nor to the shots in the air. They didn't leave because of the prayers that all the soldiers made from inside, asking God for protection. On the contrary, this last thing provoked laughter from them. Laughter that came from outside, that sounded like hyenas. Laughter that then joined with words they didn't understand, but that undoubtedly mocked their fear. For a moment, there was total silence. Silence out there. It seemed like they had finally left, that they would have a chance to get out of there, run to their truck on the outskirts of town. But there was also doubt, because although nobody wanted to express it, nobody wanted to say it out loud. They knew they were in Nagual territory. It was well known that there were many in the area, but of course, nobody believed in them. One doesn't believe until there's no choice. That's what they were discussing when one of the soldiers heard something next to the wall, and he approached, convinced that something was rubbing against the window. But it wasn't that. When he shone his lamp, he saw a hand entering between the door planks. Not a paw, not an animal's claws, a very long hand with thin fingers covered in black fur but with human nails. And the hand was looking for the latch to open. There were shots. There were calls on the radio. The desperate call that my brother responded to, the one that led to finding them scared to death. And perhaps nobody would have believed this story if it weren't, because while they were rescuing them, while they were listening to this story, dozens of soldiers were witnesses to how howls surrounded them from the darkness, as if letting them see that everything that was being told had truly happened. My brother arrived only to witness that story, the fear they lived through. But it was enough to get scared, to understand that something very strange was nearby. And well, I had an experience with my grandfather. We've both believed in the Nagual since we were very young. It's something we believe in and respect. And it was because of that moment of tension that also reminded him of so many things from our childhood. That moment I could also feel it. Hundreds of kilometers away in another city. I felt the fear my brother lived through that night. And I understand that Naguales are for many people just fantasy, folklore, legends. But please pay attention to the howls in the night, especially if you're alone in the middle of a town with few people. Or worse yet, if you hear them in the forest, you never know what's out there. My name is Ramiro, Community. Nice to greet you. I already sent a story from my childhood once, but it hasn't come out yet, and now I'm going to try with this one. I was deployed in the north, in an area more or less close to Madera, Chihuahua. In my first year in the army, I had entered, and I say it without shame because I had no other paths left. I can't say more about the exact location, of course, but I mention that place so you can more or less locate yourselves. My mother died when I was 15. My father, not even worth mentioning, and the only person I had left was my grandmother, my mother's mother, there in a little town in Sonora. Enlisting, as I say, wasn't a heroic or patriotic act, as happens with many of my companions. It was hunger and necessity. But she, my grandmother, my second mother, hugged me as if I had chosen glory. My problem is that I hid something in the exams. It was my right ear, an accident when I was a child, an infection poorly healed that I got from an animal, an insect that got inside or something like that. The thing is, I hear little from that side, almost nothing. And in training, that was hell. I learned to sleep with my good ear facing the troop, to turn my head just enough, to pretend I heard complete orders. A soldier who doesn't hear is a problem, and I couldn't allow myself to be one. It was in that first year, in the silent hazing of the nights without light, when I met Iglesias, a young, thin man. What can I tell you? Community, a scrawny boy, He wasn't over 20. His mother had also died, and he was raised by his grandmother, just like me. So we connected from the first conversation we had. We became close not because of affinity, but because of necessity. We were two orphans trying to be family. And inside, in that detachment, the night watch was done one at a time. Long shifts, sometimes useless. Well, most of the time actually, because very rarely were there suspicious movements or armed groups. But it was worse to get overconfident. Iglesias had watch duty 2 nights in a row, and it was the second of these when he started to report the strange thing. He didn't ask for any kind of support reporting danger. He whispered on the radio and said, "She is up there." "Who, soldier?" "The woman." We all thought he was seeing silhouettes, normal shadows from the hills. But he insisted. "She has a black dress. Where do you see her?" "In the trees, but not on the ground. She's up there." This was what started making the others nervous, because it's one thing to see a crow in 3 branches, and quite another to see it up high where only birds reach. Afterward, he didn't know or didn't want to explain more. 100%, he told us exactly the same thing. Just like that. Dry. Concise. "Yes, there was a lady in some trees." And look, not even to me, who had much more confidence with him than the others, did he dare to tell me anything more. The third night, it wasn't his turn for watch, but he asked to switch shifts with another. He didn't want to sleep, or couldn't. At 2:10 in the morning, he spoke on the radio again. His voice wasn't trembling or hysterical. It was very flat, almost calm, more so than the other nights, in fact. "The woman is here again. Does she move?" I asked. "No, she just looks this way. She looks at us, looks toward the camp." Someone asked him what angle to calculate visibility. "From above." "Holy shit, she's already in the trees." "Which tree is she in?" "In all of them." That was the last thing he said. Then silence, simply and plainly. Silence, and nothing more. When we went out to look for him, there were no signs of a fight or any incident. We heard nothing more. No shots, no footsteps, no sounds in the branches. We didn't see footprints going into the forest either. But there was something above us, up there, in the treetops. There was Iglesias, my companion, my friend Iglesias, coiled among the highest branches of an enormous sabino tree, about 18-20 meters high. I didn't measure it. It was impossible to climb up there, impossible. He wasn't hanging or impaled or tied, just there, embedded among the branches, as if he had fallen from above and the tree had stopped him, as if he had fallen from very high. But the doctor told us he didn't have free-fall fractures, that it was as if they 6:58 p.m. had left him up there. Nothing more. But he didn't look attacked, or devoured, or have anything destroyed. It was as if they had placed the body up there, like a reverse offering, said those who went up to bring the body down. The official report was accident. They brought him down in silence. The captain ordered any comment silenced. The mass was held without a body because they couldn't deliver it in time. The grandmother never knew the position in which he was found or where. As far as I know, she didn't know anything about it, and I couldn't betray the institution's trust to tell her. Well, what was I going to tell her anyway? We were given 15 days of rest without explanation. The kind of rest where the last thing you do is rest, where you just think and think and think. What came after wasn't persecution or special patrols. It was something that still seems even more disturbing to me, a strange constancy. Every time we passed through that area, regardless of the rainy season, someone saw her. Never head-on, never close, always above, among the treetops, peeking out. The first time I saw her is one of the worst nights of my life. It was a horrible face, not just because of the appearance. A thin woman, still, dressed in black, with very wide and furious eyes. but also because of how unnatural it was to see a human being moving among the branches like a beast. Sometimes in a single treetop, as I saw her, sometimes, according to the youngest ones, she was seen as if duplicated in several places. The same woman in several places at once, without movement, just watching, as if waiting for the next one of us. Someone else who for some reason of tragedy like what brought Iglesias. And poor Iglesias. I requested my discharge a year later. Not out of fear. I think it was weariness or tiredness, a lot of tiredness, or I simply understood that my grandmother was the only thing I had. And although she was proud, she didn't want to bury another grandson. Iglesias wasn't my blood, but he was the closest thing to a brother I had that year. Nobody talks about him. There's no plaque, no sign with his name or anything. In fact, almost nobody remembers anymore. There's only one point in the forest where nobody wants to stand watch, and not because of what might happen below at ground level, but because of what might be waiting for you above, what might take you. The witch, as the youngest ones call her, the witch up there in the trees, the witch of the treetops. When I sleep on my side, I put my good ear toward the door. Habit, they told me in therapy, but it's not that. It's that I think about him, about Iglesias, about the brotherhood we had, and about death, about his death. It hurts me a lot truly, to think about those last moments when he was perhaps hoping that I could help him, when he trusted me. I wasn't there to help him. I think about the last thing he must have lived through, about what took him up there, about the fact that he was the only person who touched that thing, who saw it up close, that woman who scares even the most experienced. And the more it scares them, the less they want to talk about her, about the woman in the trees.